So Rumi, the 13th century Sufi mystic, wrote the following: "Only the supremely brave ever admit how helpless they are in the hands of God. As for the others, building and decorating their sandcastles, look how one wild wave shatters them all." This is a sermon about death and love. It's a sermon about how the denial of death is actually a denial of life, because confronting death rather than hiding from it can actually imbue our lives with meaning and with purpose, and can remind us of the eternal power of love. I've been waiting to give this sermon for almost a year, and then just in the last month, 2 tragic deaths have struck our community. To Jesse and Amit, to Ziv and Oren, your sons, and to Lester and Linda. I want you to know that we hold such deep sorrow with your family, and knowing only a glimpse of the pain that you've suffered in the last 5 weeks since Gidi died on Labor Day weekend, I know I'm not alone in saying that I would give anything in the world to help lift the pain away. But I also know full well that none of us can take it away. All we can do is meet you in the darkness and cry with you and sing with you and remind you of how extraordinary your little boy was and all the love that he gave and received. And just 2 weeks ago, we also lost Gary. And Mimi and Eli and Dash will be with us tomorrow. You know, 50-year-olds are not supposed to go to bed on Tuesday night and not wake up Wednesday morning. That's not the way the world is supposed to work. And Gary was profoundly decent, and he was kind and compassionate and lived with integrity, and so many people in this room called him a friend. And I don't think Gary ever expected a shout out on Kol Nidre, because shul wasn't really his thing. But I really hope that he feels the deep and profound affection and admiration that have been pouring out for him over the past couple of weeks and tonight. My friend Label Fine, who was a luminary and an intellectual and an activist, lost his daughter Nomi when she was 30 years old to a sudden heart attack. And in his grief, he wrote a book called Against the Dying of the Light, named for the poem of the great Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, who wrote, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light." Label wrote that writing in response to tragic loss was one way for him to keep Nomi alive and at the same time accept the fact of her death, both of which he desperately needed to do. So I want to speak tonight to honor Gidi and to honor Gary and to honor the memories of all of those that we have lost this past year, in a humble attempt to create the space to hold the loss and at the same time to rage against the dying of the light. I've told you over the years about my grandma Millie's life, and I told you a little bit also about her death. She lived to be 98 years old, and toward the end, her body slowed down slightly, but still she went out for a cocktail and dinner every night. She played bridge almost every day and almost always won. She had an active social calendar, and she loved to scream at the news. She was feisty, and she was spirited, and she was really alive. I flew to Florida late one night to take her out to breakfast the next morning, and she was sleeping when I got there, so I let myself in and went to sleep in the guest room. And I was awakened in the middle of the night by voices in the other room, so I ran in. She had collapsed to the floor beside the bed. "I'm such a dummy, Sharon," she said. "I fell on my way to the bathroom." She was trying to get up, but the EMTs wouldn't let her move. They suspected from the way that her leg was positioned that she had broken her hip. "The tall one," my grandma whispered as they put her on the gurney. "He's really handsome, isn't he?" At the hospital, the doctors consulted one another, but not us, and they determined that she needed to have hip surgery. I said to them, "She's 98 years old. Is hip surgery the only option?" They said, "Without a doubt," and they assured her that she'd be back to playing bridge in no time. My grandma survived that surgery, but she was not the same person when she came out. She still made some jokes the next day, and she flirted a little bit, but she was exhausted, and she was in tremendous pain. And by day 2, it was clear that the trajectory was not good. And as the situation worsened, her caregivers started to say with ever greater urgency how close she was to recovery. Don't worry, Mrs. Gordon, don't worry. Everything's going to be just fine. And each time they said it, I would get more and more agitated because it was clear to me, and I'm sure it was also clear to them, how close she was to the end. But no one, not the nurses, not the doctors, and ultimately not even I, had the courage to tell her that this was it. I remember years ago, Atul Gawande wrote a piece for The New Yorker, a groundbreaking piece called Letting Go. He's a renowned surgeon, and he writes about issues related to medicine and public health. This article is a full frontal attack on the American medical system for its failure to properly care for people at the end of life, instead pushing us toward expensive and painful treatments that may delay death and certainly diminish the quality of life. He argues that longevity ought not be the singular goal, that quality of life and freedom from pain and mental awareness are far more important to most people, but our medical system is simply not designed to accommodate those priorities. In this article, Gawande tells a story of a palliative care doctor named Susan Block. Palliative care, for those who are not familiar, is a kind of specialized medical care that provides relief not only from the symptoms, but also the stress of serious illness. And its goal is to improve the quality of life, physically and spiritually and psychologically, for patients and for their families toward the end. So Block's job is to train doctors to learn how to have honest conversations with their patients about what they are living for and how, if given the choice, they want to die. She has guided literally thousands of people through these difficult conversations in her tenure as a palliative care doctor. Well, at some point, Block gets a phone call that her father, who's a professor at Berkeley, has been diagnosed with a mass growing in the spinal cord of his neck. The surgery that he needs to go through is risky. It's likely to leave him paralyzed from the neck down. She flies out, and she gets to him the night before surgery. They sit together, they chat, they say goodbye. She leaves for the night. She's driving away, and she's halfway across the Bay Bridge when she realizes that she, an expert in end-of-life conversations and care, avoided talking to her own father about what really mattered to him. And in desperation, she turns the car around and drives back. I don't know if this is possible, but when I first read that story, and even now as I retell that story, I imagine her doing a U-turn in the middle of the Bay Bridge. She races back to the hospital, goes up to his room and says, "Dad, I need to understand how much you're willing to go through to have a shot at being alive, and what level of being alive is actually tolerable to you." Her father answers, "As long as I'm able to eat chocolate ice cream and watch football on TV, I am willing to stay alive." She is absolutely astonished. She has never in her life seen this professor at Berkeley watch a football game. But she learned so much because she asked. I read that article 6 years ago, and I think about it all the time. We live in a death-denying culture where avoidance and repression are the names of the game, and we presume that we simply couldn't function were we to live in constant awareness of how close we all stand to the edge. One of the former editors of the New York Times Style section wrote a book in which she says that the United States is a nation of beauty junkies, addicts, searching perpetually for the next fix to keep us looking young and gorgeous. And let's be honest, we are right here, right now, in the epicenter in Los Angeles. It's not our fault. It's the culture and the time that we live in, but let's be honest about what's actually happening here. We fear getting old because we're afraid that it will make us irrelevant, and we're afraid that it will take us one step closer to the grave. And it's as if with every nip and tuck and dye, we are postponing aging and therefore magically holding death at bay. So we come up with all kinds of diversions to distract us from the ultimate reality of death, so much so that when death inevitably collides with life, as it does, we are completely shocked and ill-equipped to deal with it. Maybe that's why I was so moved when I met a man named Michael Hebb 2 years ago at a Reboot Summit in Park City, Utah. Within 2 minutes of our schmooze over drinks and dessert, he told me the story of the death of his father. David always says that the thing about schmoozing a rabbi is that there's no room for chit-chat. You go straight to the heart of the matter, even if you're in a bar. So Michael's father had Alzheimer's, and it was very severe, and he was put into a nursing home. And one night, Michael, who was 12 years old at the time, bolted out of bed with a start. He looked at the clock. It said 3:43 a.m. So he went back to sleep. The next morning, he found out that his father had died in the night. And inexplicably, 3:43 a.m. was the official time of his death. I couldn't shake the 3:43 a.m. detail. Just a few months earlier, one of you had told me the story that at the precise moment that your mother died, you saw the drapes in her room rustle, even though there was no breeze. And another of you described a blue light that you saw rising above your mother's head just after her final breath. Last month, at a Shiva in our community, one of you shared that a bird flew into your office the day after your mother's death, circled over your head 3 times, and then flew out, leaving you with a distinct impression that she was with you even still. I thought about my dear friend whose electrical appliances keep breaking, and she feels certain that even though she doesn't believe in any of this stuff, her sister, who died many years ago, is trying now to send her a message. And I thought about this kind couple that drove me to the airport after I did a scholar in residence in their shul. When we stopped at a traffic light, they grabbed each other's hands, and they looked into one another's eyes with tears. And then they looked back at me and they said, I hope you don't find this strange, but we lost our son in a car accident on this road years ago. And every time we get to this light, we feel him. We feel his presence, like he's reaching out to us here and telling us that he's okay. Now, what do we do with these stories? We file them among inexplicable things that you need to tell someone, so you tell your rabbi because you think at least she won't think you're crazy, right? Well, I happen to have brought one book with me to Park City that weekend. It was Ellie Spitz's book, Rabbi Ellie Spitz, Does the Soul Survive? That book had sat on my shelf for several years, and I randomly grabbed it, I don't know why, to be my companion for the weekend. And when I couldn't sleep after hearing Michael Hebb's story about 3:43 a.m., I started to read this book. Rabbi Spitz writes that most rabbis, even really good rabbis, are reluctant to speak about immortality and the soul and the afterlife and reincarnation. We chalk up reports of mysterious moments to strange occurrences, X-Files. And instead, we talk about building a life of meaning in this world and perpetuating the lives of our loved ones by honoring their memories. And that's not actually wrong. It's just not nearly the whole picture. In limiting our conversation to the here and now, says Spitz, we deprive ourselves and we deprive each other of ancient Jewish wisdom on alternative levels of consciousness and the mysteries of life and death and the soul as a dimension of existence. I wonder how many people in this room know that it was a widely held Talmudic idea that after death, the soul separated from the body and still held a fully conscious existence. In the Middle Ages, Jewish philosophers believed that the soul was unique and immortal and entered the body to fulfill a particular task for that life. That is not something that I learned in religious school or even in rabbinical school, where I never once heard the idea of the survival of the soul or heard that reincarnation was in any way a serious Jewish idea. So the next morning at breakfast, I told Michael that I was so moved by this conversation, what a relief it was to be able to speak so frankly about loss and grief and the mysteries of death. And Michael told me about a project that he started called deathoverdinner.org, which was premised on the idea that we need to talk honestly and openly about the most painful and most universal human experience, death. So why not do it over really good wine and food? Within 2 years of launching Death Over Dinner, a couple 100,000 dinners around the country and the world happened. And participants started writing in that their experiences, rather than leaving them scared and depressed were nothing short of life-affirming. It was immediately clear to me that we needed to do something together. We needed to create a Death Over Dinner Jewish edition. We needed to help break the taboo around death and turn the dinner table into a sacred space where we could share and laugh and cry together. I wanted for our community to have the resources to tap into ancient Jewish ideas about the soul and the afterlife, conversations that we too often avoid out of ignorance and unease. But not only the afterlife, I wanted for us to create a space for soulful and informed conversations about end-of-life care and living will and advanced directives and healthcare proxies. How does Judaism advise us regarding decisions about feeding tubes and respirators and organ donations? How long should we fight to preserve life? And when do we let someone go with dignity? What do we do when family members are estranged or disagree on treatments? We need to have these conversations, not only so that our families know what our wishes are. As one of my friends who's in palliative care likes to say, it's always too early to have the conversation until it's too late. But also somehow, because talking about dying reminds us that we are still alive. I wanted for our community to be knowledgeable about Jewish traditions of death and dying and burial, because they are some of the most meaningful and powerful traditions that we have. And perhaps most importantly of all, I wanted for us to be able to make space for conversations that would help us be more present when someone we love or when we suffer a loss or approach death ourselves, so that we could be better friends and family members and community members as we walk one another through chapters of grief and pain. How do I show up for someone I love? What do I say when there simply are no words? Or even more to the point, what do I not say when there simply are no words? So we've spent the past year working with a team of rabbis and palliative care doctors and hospice workers and psychologists to curate the very best and most accessible and most inspiring material to help guide these conversations around dying and death and grief and soul. And now, powered by a generous grant from the Jewish Community Foundation, our new website, Death Over Dinner Jewish Edition, is ready to go. It's our hope that everyone in our community and far beyond will participate in at least one death dinner over the course of the coming year. It was clear to me that we had to launch this project at Yom Kippur, our annual deep dive into our mortality, the one time when we step out of our death-denying culture and we peer with open eyes and an open heart into the deep. Every year when we come here, we talk about how these rituals are designed to bring us into a kind of deathscape. We don't eat, we don't drink, we wear white. We immerse ourselves in memories of our loved ones who have died. We repeat these awful words, who will live and who will die, again and again, wrestling with the realization that the stark and bitter and awful reality is that some of us will be here next year and some of us will not. Yom Kippur is rooted in the assumption that we have more clarity about what matters most when we stand at the edge of life. And so on Yom Kippur, we go there together to ask ourselves the questions of the palliative care doctors. What matters most to you now? And what are you willing to do about it? This is really painful stuff. It's very real. I now see Yom Kippur as one big collective U-turn on the middle of the Bay Bridge. This is our chance to turn around, to go back to Shuvah, to do and say what needs to be said now before it's too late. And doing this with a full and open heart will not take away the grief. It will not heal our broken hearts. But the premise of this holy day is that an honest confrontation with our vulnerability will help us live with deeper meaning and purpose and with greater love. Paul Kalaniti wrote a beautiful memoir called When Breath Becomes Air, about his struggle as a 36-year-old rising star neurosurgeon who was diagnosed with fatal lung cancer. He writes that the shadow of death obscured the meaning of any action until he found his mantra from the words of Samuel Beckett: I can't go on, I'll go on. I can't go on, I'll go on. So he gets out of bed and he takes one step forward, repeating this phrase again and again, I can't go on, I'll go on. That morning, he says, he made an important decision. I would have to learn to live in a different way, seeing death as an imposing itinerant visitor, but knowing that even if I'm dying, until I actually die, I am still living. We can't go on, we'll go on. All of us will die. And yet most of us are not actively dying today. Nevertheless, we are brought to this place to confront the fragility of our sandcastles, because our tradition in all of its wisdom recognizes the need to remind us that until we actually die, we're still alive. After working in hospice and palliative care for 25 years and emergency medicine for 15 years, Dr. Ira Bayak worked with thousands of dying patients and their families. And based on the wisdom that he acquired working with people at the end of life, he identified what he calls the 4 things that matter most. And here they are. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Thank you. I love you. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Thank you, and I love you. I have come to understand that the whole point of this liturgy and this music and these rituals and this fast is to bring us to the edge of life so that we can find the will and the urgency and the courage to say what needs to be said now while we still can, to overcome that deeply embedded cultural urge to hide from the reality of our vulnerability and realize that for all that we cannot control in our lives and in the world, we can ask for forgiveness, we can forgive, we can thank, and we can love. Angelo Marandino and his wife Jen were married for 5 months when she was diagnosed with cancer. And as she started to get really sick, they felt that they needed to communicate to family and friends what they were going through, but words seemed to be failing them. And so he started to photograph her. In the end, he created a photo documentary which is brutal and beautiful, an intimate window into their battle with cancer. After Jen's death, he started a foundation to support women who are fighting breast cancer called The Love We Share, which was inspired by one of their last conversations. In his words, before going to sleep, Jen and I used to ask each other what the best and worst parts of the day were. Usually the best part was something like when you walked by me and ran your fingers through my hair, or when we were at the hospital and you held my hand. The day after we found out that Jen's liver was failing, we came home with hospice care and spent the evening with family and friends. And that night, as we lay next to each other, for possibly the last time, I asked Jen what she loved the most about that day. Jen thought for a moment and then turned, and looking deeper into my eyes than ever before, Jen said, I loved it all. In the end, folks, there is only love. When the soul has left the body and the burial's over and the crowds go home, what's left is love. In our tradition, the act of burying a loved one, of lifting earth to cover a coffin, is an act of ritual defiance to the culture of death denial. Because the sound of earth hitting the top of a coffin is the starkest and most powerful and most painful awakening to the reality and the finality of death. And we call that in Hebrew an act of chesed shel emet, the deepest and purest kind of love. And now, over the years, as I have stood with many of you as you place earth gently and lovingly on the graves of parents and grandparents and friends and even children, I know that you know exactly the power of that gift of love. From birth, every one of us has a deep and irrepressible need for human connection, and it's with us to the very end. Utzror bitzror achayim, we say in El Malei Rachamim, may his soul be bound up in the bond of life. And at the graveside, when we stand over our dead, we suddenly remember that we are all connected to one another in this world and beyond. We remember that life's great calling is to recognize and honor above all else that love is what manifests that sacred connection. to love deeply, and to let ourselves be loved deeply. This is how we become bound up in the bond of life. As Roger Cohen once wrote, "The living are the custodians of the souls of the dead." Love bequeaths us that responsibility. It's really hard to remember the depths of human connectedness, to remember that what matters most is running your fingers through your loved one's hair. So tonight and tomorrow, we stand here to be reminded. It's a new school year. The election is upon us. And yet today, we take a day out of life to remind ourselves that when it's all said and done, whether we get to live 85 years on this earth, or 50, or 5, what's left is love. And so now we go together to the brink. We do this not to punish ourselves, not to wallow in grief, but to remember that even as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, our work is to live, and to live with a vengeance. We can't go on, we'll go on. Today we commit to living with forgiveness, with gratitude, and most importantly, with love. Because in the end, that's what it means to be bound up in the bond of life. Gamar Chatima Tova.